While Donald Trump was publicly threatening Canada with sweeping 35% tariffs, mocking the country as weak, and joking about turning it into the 51st state, a far more serious and far more damaging shift was taking place quietly behind closed doors in Brussels, one that Washington failed to anticipate, failed to detect, and failed to stop until it was already irreversible. On December 1st, 2025, Canada finalized a strategic agreement that delivered one of the most humiliating blows to American influence in modern defense history, and according to leaked internal assessments from the Pentagon, senior U.S. defense officials only became aware of the full scope of what had happened after the paperwork was signed and the political commitments were locked in. This was not about symbolic diplomacy or routine trade negotiations, and it was not some abstract disagreement between allies. This was about control over roughly 150 billion euros in European defense financing, equivalent to approximately 244 billion Canadian dollars, and about the United States being shut out entirely, while Canada secured privileged access. It was about Canada positioning itself inside the core of Europe's future military-industrial ecosystem, while American defense firms, which had dominated transatlantic security markets for decades, suddenly found themselves on the outside looking in. The mechanism at the center of this shift is SAFE, Security Action for Europe, a massive defense financing initiative created by the European Union to reduce long-term dependence on U.S. military protection and U.S.-based defense production. SAFE is not a think tank, a treaty framework, or a political statement. It is a hard-financed industrial engine built around low-interest loans, backed by the EU's collective credit rating, specifically designed to fund large-scale production of missiles, artillery, ammunition, drones, air defense systems, cyber warfare tools, space-based capabilities, and next-generation military technologies at an industrial scale that Europe has not sustained since the Cold War. European leaders looked at Russia's continued war in Ukraine, watched years of uncertainty generated by Trump's first term, absorbed his re-election, and renewed threats against NATO allies, and concluded that betting Europe's long-term security on the stability of U.S. domestic politics was no longer viable. SAFE was conceived as the financial backbone of European strategic autonomy, with an explicit goal of making Europe militarily self-sufficient by 2030. From the beginning, SAFE was designed to be exclusive. Membership was limited to EU states only. The United Kingdom, despite its deep defense ties and advanced military industry, was rejected after Brexit. Australia lobbied aggressively, and was never seriously considered. Even the United States, the world's largest military power, and Europe's traditional security guarantor, was left completely outside the framework. Canada, however, succeeded where every other non-European country failed. Canada became the first and only non-EU nation granted full participation in SAFE, an unprecedented decision that reshaped the balance of transatlantic defense cooperation. In the most consequential European defense initiative since the end of the Cold War, the only external country given a seat at the table was Canada, not the United States, not Britain, not any Indo-Pacific ally. The political timing could not have been more devastating for Trump. While he was publicly attacking Canadian leadership, branding Canada a security threat, and threatening to cripple its economy through tariffs, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was quietly negotiating access to hundreds of billions of dollars in defense contracts that American firms are now effectively barred from. To understand why this represents such a catastrophic strategic failure for Washington, it is essential to understand how dependent Canada once was on the United States. For decades, more than 70% of Canadian defense procurement flowed directly to American suppliers. Canadian firms built components for U.S. weapons platforms, adopted American standards, and structured their entire defense industrial base around integration with the U.S. system. Canada had virtually no diversification, no leverage, and no credible alternative suppliers. That dependency left Canada uniquely vulnerable to political pressure, and Trump exploited it repeatedly. During his first term, and again during his second, Trump treated Canada less like an ally and more like an adversary, imposing 25% tariffs, threatening to dismantle the Canadian auto sector, humiliating Canadian leaders in public forums, and escalating to threats of 35% tariffs on all goods after Canada supported Palestinian statehood at the United Nations. This was not routine trade negotiation. It was sustained economic coercion directed at America's closest partner. What Trump failed to account for was a critical political transition in Ottawa. In January 2025, Justin Trudeau announced his resignation amid collapsing public support and looming electoral defeat. The Liberal Party appeared headed for disaster until Mark Carney entered the race. Carney was not a traditional politician. He was the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, a figure with deep credibility in global finance and international negotiation. He won the Liberal leadership in March 2025 with an overwhelming mandate and assumed office with a clear strategic objective: reduce Canada's dependence on a single, unpredictable partner that treated alliances as leverage points rather than commitments. Within months, Carney began quietly executing that strategy. In June 2025, Canada signed a security and defense partnership agreement with the European Union that most observers dismissed as symbolic. In reality, it laid the legal, regulatory, and diplomatic groundwork for Canada's safe application. 6 months later, the process was complete. Canada secured full safe participation, including access to its financing mechanisms and industrial planning frameworks. European officials fast-tracked the application, not out of charity, but out of self-interest, seeking a stable North American partner that would not weaponize trade policy or threaten allies over political disagreements. The benefits Canada gained are profound. Canadian defense firms now have direct access to compete for safe-funded projects across 27 European countries, not as peripheral suppliers, but as integrated participants in long-term production chains that will define European defense for decades. When Poland needs missiles, when Germany needs drones, when France needs ammunition, Canadian firms can bid on those contracts with near equal standing to EU companies. American defense contractors cannot. Even more damaging to U.S. interests, Canada negotiated exemptions to SAFE's strict localization rules. While standard SAFE projects require that at least 65% of production value originate within the EU, Canada secured special provisions, allowing Canadian firms to account for up to 80% of system value in high-demand sectors, such as drones, counter-drone systems, missile components, ammunition manufacturing, advanced sensors, and cyber capabilities. These are precisely the sectors in which American firms have historically dominated global markets, and Canada now enjoys preferential access, while the United States remains excluded. Canada also gained access to the EU's low-interest financing, made possible by Europe's 8AA credit rating, enabling long-term industrial planning, factory construction, workforce expansion, and capacity building on a scale that would have taken decades without such financing. To manage this transformation, Canada established a permanent defense investment agency dedicated exclusively to safe participation, tasked with coordinating Canadian industry engagement with European procurement authorities over a 30 to 45-year horizon, with internal targets measured in tens of billions of dollars annually by 2030. The implications extend far beyond defense contracts. Since World War II, the Western security order has been built on the assumption that American security guarantees are reliable and indispensable. European countries underinvested in defense because they assumed the United States would always fill the gap. Canada did the same, consistently falling short of NATO's 2% spending target. But when the President of the United States openly questions alliance commitments, threatens economic warfare against allies, and suggests annexation rhetoric, that assumption collapses. European leaders responded by creating SAFE, and when choosing a partner to help anchor that system, they chose Canada because it demonstrated consistency, predictability, and respect for alliances. Canada now has leverage it never had before. When Trump threatens tariffs or political domination, Canada can credibly point to Europe and say it has alternatives. The decision was not without risk. The European Union is fragmented, bureaucratic, and politically complex, with competing national interests and slow decision-making processes. Projects can stall, priorities can shift, and political changes can derail long-term plans. There is also the risk of U.S. retaliation if Trump views Canada's European alignment as strategic betrayal. But Canada made the calculation that diversification was worth the risk, and that calculation speaks volumes about the damage Trump inflicted on American credibility. When a country's closest ally concludes that Europe is a safer strategic partner than the United States, that is not a routine disagreement. It is a collapse of trust. The deal is complete, ratification is imminent, and Canadian firms are expected to begin bidding on European defense contracts in early 2026. Europe is accelerating toward full defense readiness by 2030, with combined spending projected to exceed $1 trillion when safe loans, national budgets, and broader rearmament initiatives are combined. The United States is absent from this system not because it was excluded by hostile powers, but because its own leadership treated allies as adversaries. This is the cost of mistaking coercion for strength, of confusing bullying with negotiation, and of turning partnership into domination. What makes this next phase even more consequential is how it ripples outward beyond Canada and Europe and begins to quietly rewrite assumptions that have anchored Western power for generations. Because once SAFE moved from theory into execution, defense planners across allied capitals started asking a question that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. What happens if the United States is no longer the default center of gravity for allied security planning? Inside NATO, officials have privately acknowledged that SAFE represents more than just an industrial policy shift. It represents a psychological break from automatic reliance on Washington, a recognition that American guarantees are now contingent on domestic politics rather than shared values. European defense ministries have begun coordinating procurement timelines independently of U.S. production cycles, deliberately designing systems that do not rely on American components, American licensing approvals, or American political goodwill. Canadian integration into SAFE accelerates that process because Canada brings advanced manufacturing capacity, deep technical expertise, and intelligence interoperability without the political volatility that has come to define U.S. leadership under Trump. Within Brussels, senior officials at the European Commission have described Canada's participation as proof that strategic trust now outweighs geography and that reliability matters more than raw power. This shift has not gone unnoticed in Asia or the Middle East, where allied governments are watching Europe hedge against American unpredictability and quietly considering similar diversification strategies of their own. Defense firms that once structured their entire business models around access to U.S. export approvals are now recalculating, investing in European-aligned production lines, retooling supply chains, and in some cases, relocating operations entirely to jurisdictions insulated from Washington's political swings. Inside the United States, this transformation has triggered internal alarm among career defense officials who understand what is being lost, even if political leadership does not. The erosion is not just economic, it is structural. Influence in alliance systems does not disappear overnight. It drains away as alternatives become normalized, as new habits form, and as partners stop instinctively looking to Washington first. That process is now underway, and it is accelerating precisely because it was never meant to be public. There was no dramatic rupture, no formal break with the United States, no press conference announcing a new bloc. Instead, there was a quiet recalibration, carried out through financing mechanisms, procurement rules, and industrial planning documents, the kind of decisions that shape power decades into the future while attracting almost no immediate headlines. Trump's tariff threats did not force Europe and Canada apart from the United States in a dramatic confrontation. They convinced them, step by step, that building without the United States was simply safer. And that is the most damaging outcome of all, because once allies learn how to function without you, they rarely forget how. The long-term danger for the United States is that this realignment does not end with Canada, because once one trusted ally demonstrates that meaningful security diversification is possible without triggering immediate collapse, others inevitably begin to explore the same path, and that dynamic is already unfolding quietly across allied capitals, where defense planners are reassessing decades-old assumptions about dependence and leverage. Officials inside the European Union now openly discuss SAFE as a template rather than a one-off, a modular system that can expand cooperation with select partners, while insulating Europe from political shocks emanating from Washington. Canada's successful integration has effectively stress-tested that model, proving that a non-EU democracy can be woven into Europe's defense industrial core without compromising security, cohesion, or strategic autonomy. That lesson is being studied closely by countries like Japan, South Korea, and even segments of the British defense establishment, all of whom are watching how Canada gained access, not by demanding privilege, but by offering stability, long-term commitment, and the absence of coercive trade behavior. Inside Washington, however, the response has been fragmented and reactive, with political leadership focused on short-term messaging rather than structural loss. Tariffs can be imposed overnight, but industrial ecosystems take decades to build, and once contracts, factories, and supply chains are established elsewhere, they do not simply revert because rhetoric changes. Defense influence is cumulative. It accrues through shared production, interoperable systems, and trust built over years of predictable behavior. By treating alliances as transactional and trade as a weapon, Donald Trump accelerated the very outcome he claimed to oppose, a world in which American power is still formidable but no longer indispensable. Canada's move did not weaken NATO overnight, did not dissolve alliances, and did not announce a post-American order, but it did something far more consequential. It showed that alternatives could be built quietly, legally, and effectively, while the United States was distracted by its own internal politics. Power rarely disappears in dramatic collapses. It erodes when others stop organizing their future around you. And that is exactly what is happening now, not through rebellion or hostility, but through planning, financing, and the slow, deliberate construction of a security architecture that assumes American unpredictability is a permanent condition rather than a temporary aberration.